Good evening. It is Tuesday night. This is the Douglas Hills Church of Christ. This is our regular Tuesday night class on the history of the crucifixion. The crucifixion is a historic event. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Our God and Father in heaven, we are thankful, Father, for this day. Thankful, Father, for yet another opportunity to study your word. Father, we're thankful for this opportunity that we're given through live stream, through technology, to be able to come together on this night and on other nights throughout the week, Father. What a tremendous blessing it is for us in this very difficult time to still have an outlet to study your word together as one. Father, we're particularly thankful this evening as we immerse ourselves in this study of the crucifixion for the act in which we study and for the example with which we are left by it. Father, we are thankful for the gospel writers and the accounts that they provide us. We're thankful for the understanding that we're able to gain through history, that we're able to gain through examining these gospels, but we're particularly thankful, and most of all thankful every day, Father, for the act of the crucifixion itself. We know that Jesus' death, which he did on his own accord, was for us, not for him, not for the sins that he had committed, but for the sins that we commit and for the potential of eternal salvation for us, and we are thankful for it. It's in his glorious name that we pray. Amen. All right, so last week we went through the sort of long examination of the trial before the Sanhedrin. We spent a good deal of time kind of slowing down, if you will, in this examination of what it meant for a Jewish trial, what it meant to go through a trial of the Sanhedrin and go through a trial before the body of 71, the Great Sanhedrin as it's called, which came together in the house of Caiaphas on the night in which Jesus had been turned over, having been betrayed in the Garden of Gethsemane by Judas, having been arrested and bound there and led off to the house of Caiaphas. And then he faces Annas, who is the high priest, sort of the grand patriarch of the high priestly family, maybe the most powerful Jew in all of Judea, likely the most powerful Jew in all of Judea. And then he faces the great Sanhedrin, this body which dates itself back to the age of Moses, dates itself back from the Exodus and the coming out of Egypt. This body which is made up of the wisest men in all the land. We really slowed down in a series of passages that sometimes we breeze right through whenever we're looking at the crucifixion, whenever we think about the crucifixion. We really slowed down and immersed ourselves in this to really understand all of the various things that go on, and what is a very long night for Jesus. A night that begins, of course, with the Last Supper and extends into the garden, and then has extended now all the way through the night. And where we left off with our period together last week, it is morning. And we're told by multiple gospel writers that whenever morning came, immediately the elders and the high priest take Jesus to the prefect. Now, if you've missed any of our previous classes, this is our 10th, as you can see. I encourage you to go back. But this one is this evening when we begin to have this conversation now about the trial before the prefect, the trial before Pontius Pilate. This is one of those instances, one of those stories in the Bible, one of those moments in history that is so well known that one need not have any understanding of any of the things that we've discussed before to realize the significance of this trial that takes place before Pilate and this moment that takes place before Pilate. But nonetheless, I think that what you're starting to see in these trials and in these weeks is all of these lessons that we've discussed over the past 10 weeks all coming together at one. You're starting to see the influence of the Herodians. That'll be even more relevant tonight, and we'll see again the influence of the Herodians. We see this division that exists between, this chasm that exists between different segments of society. We've seen the way that various sects of Jewish life have all converged into one, have all been unified together in their opposition towards Jesus. We've seen the last week and the actions that took place over the course of the final week of Jesus' life and how they directly lead to him becoming the number one enemy of the state and how it lands him eventually in the arrest and eventually in this moment before the prefect. We've done all of that. And tonight, as we move towards the prefect and we move towards this final trial, I think that all of these lessons have converged together. Now, next week, I just want to make a quick note, as I have sort of a warning, as I have given in the past, that next week, as the lecture schedule there says, we're going to talk about the brutality of the crucifixion, and we're going to talk about the crucifixion in the very ugly, heinous way in which it should be understood. I've said before that we tend to think, and I even think that this is the case for the way we think about the trial before the prefect and some of the things that have happened up to this point in the narrative, as this, we see pictures sometimes of Jesus almost looks asleep almost on the cross, this sort of calm, gentle demeanor, if you will. This is not a reflection of what crucifixion was really like, and it is certainly not a reflection of the absolute torture that Jesus had to endure in the hours before he eventually makes it to the cross at Calvary. Next week, whenever we discuss that topic and we discuss the brutality of the crucifixion, we're going to talk about it in the very ugly, grotesque manner in which it deserves. Many historians throughout history have referred to crucifixion as the ultimate brutality, as the ultimate act of torture. And I think next week when we explore that, we're going to see why. Let's dive into the narrative this evening, though. Let's begin with our conversation about the trial before the prefect. A long night dominated by a trial before the Sanhedrin didn't go quite as smoothly as some of the leaders may have hoped. Despite the careful plot against him, aided by a turncoat co-conspirator, the trial against him had not been the easy affair, the easy, quick affair that many had hoped. The witnesses produced did not convict him. Eventually, it was up to the high priest himself in the most dramatic moment of the Sanhedrin trial to step in the wee hours of the morning, to stand there in the midst of the Sanhedrin and demand answers from the accused. Jesus gave him what he needed, and his declaration of blasphemy gained the conviction that Caiaphas and other leaders sought from the Sanhedrin. So, they had satisfied their religious duty. The trial was over before the Sanhedrin, but a single problem remained. Matthew chapter 27 demonstrates and provides evidence of this problem. When the morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people plotted against Jesus to put him to death. And they had bound him, and they led him away and delivered him to Pontius Pilate. When the morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people plotted against Jesus. Why are they still plotting, even though it's morning? I like what Mark says in Mark chapter 15. He gives us a little bit of a further examination of this. As soon as it was morning, the chief priests held a consultation with the elders and the scribes and the whole council, and they bound Jesus and led him away and delivered him over to Pilate. Now, they've already had the trial. He's already been convicted by the Sanhedrin. What then is the purpose of this consultation? What then is the purpose of additional plotting? One can only assume that this consultation, this coming together of the chief priests, the elders, the scribes, and the whole council, once again, is to figure out exactly how they're going to get a Roman conviction of this man. This charge, which had led to a guilty conviction by the Sanhedrin of blasphemy, wouldn't make the slightest bit of difference to the Romans. Religious crimes were the jurisdiction of the Jews, the jurisdiction of the Jewish leadership. We've discussed in great detail the two-tier system and the day-to-day affairs that the Romans left the Jews in charge of. Blasphemy is a religious crime. It isn't a political crime that Rome would care about. If they are to bring a charge of this man blaspheming, a religious crime against him, Pilate's answer to them is that this isn't his problem. So one can only assume that here, as morning arrives, a consultation is required to figure out how they're going to make this transition from a conviction of the Sanhedrin over to a conviction from the Roman prefect. The Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate. What do we know about the man who has been elevated from obscurity from this episode that he would face on this particular morning? How can we measure his motivations? How can we understand the reservations that we know he had? Is he a good guy or is he a bad guy? I have to tell you, that question isn't as easy to answer as you might think. what do we know about the man who is now the sole individual left standing between Jesus and the cross? For portions of history, we know so little about the Roman prefect that some historians claim he never existed. This is a great lesson in the dangers of becoming overly enamored by critical history. And prior to the 1960s and into the 1960s, a respectable number of historians, not a majority, but a respectable number of historians, questioned Pilate's existence at all, chalking the narrative up to a pure invention of the gospel writers. But in 1961, there's a picture of Pilate there. In 1961, during an excavation in the Roman city built by Herod of Caesarea Maritima, archaeologists found a large piece of limestone with this inscription on it. This meaning, to the divine Augustus Tiberium, Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. Okay, now that is a strong piece of evidence for the existing of the prefect. This tablet is the only inscription about a Roman prefect prior to the Roman-Jewish war that has survived to this day. The Bible was proven correct. Pontius Pilate was unquestionably real. He was unquestionably the prefect at the time of Jesus and unquestionably a critical figure in Jesus' crucifixion. Now, it's honestly quite strange that such a question was ever in doubt, that the existence of Pilate was ever in doubt. And I think that some have been guilty in ways of overstating the size of the contingency of doubters prior to the discovery of what we call the Pilate stone, that there is referred to as the Pilate stone, which you can see a replica of. You can see the real version in a museum in Jerusalem, and you can see a replica of it now in Caesarea Maritima. I think that some have been guilty of overstating how large the contingency of deniers were, but nonetheless, it removed any possibility of doubt that Pilate existed. But it's strange that there was ever a doubt at all, because Pilate is mentioned by several historians outside of the gospel narrative. Philo of Alexandria, Josephus, Ignatius of Antioch, Eusebius of Caesarea, and Tacitus all mention Pilate in one way or another. Not all of them extensively, but all of them, at least in some ways, make reference to Pilate. And in addition to those sources and the Pilate stone, we have coins minted during Pilate's time as prefect that still survive to this day. And these aren't just in museums either. You can still find these. Go to eBay, type in Pilate coin into eBay, and you can probably find them still today. You can find them through various sellers. These coins are readily available that were minted during the time of Pilate. So, if Pilate existed, what do we know about him? The name Pontius is not his first name. We actually don't know his first name. Pontius is a family name, Ponti, which gives us some valuable details itself. The Ponti family was from that region there of the Samnites, right there next to where Rome was, not far from Rome at all, there in Italy. That's where the Ponti family was from. Now, this is relatively important in the grand scheme of things, because it shows that Pilate's origins are strictly Italian, and he comes from a family that is pridefully Italian, prideful of the Roman Empire, etc. He is from a noble family, a family of nobility, but a family of the equestrian order of nobility. What does that mean? The equestrian order is the lowest rung of nobility. So, still noble, still invited to all the best parties, but in the lowest rung of noble families. His noble status would have meant that he was well educated and that he was reasonably wealthy. A good life, this is an individual and from a family who is loyal to the Roman Empire through and through. The name Pilate is likely a nickname. Like I said, we don't know what his first name was, but it's likely what we would call a nickname, which means skilled with the javelin. This here, we've actually looked at this image before, a Roman soldier. This nickname, this title probably came to Pilate during some form of military service in which he engaged in at some point in his life. So how did Pilate then, of relatively low noble rank, end up as the prefect of Judea? Well, first of all, remember that the prefect of Judea, this gets lost sometimes still, but remember, the prefect of Judea is not a great assignment. I've tried to hammer this multiple times throughout the class. It's not a great assignment. It's important to the Bible, it's important to us, but in the grand scheme of the Roman Empire, it is really not that important. The prefect actually reports to the governor of Syria, a point that we've made several times, although at the beginning of Pilate's prefecture, there's no governor of Syria in place. Over the first 6 years, actually, he doesn't have to report to the governor of Syria, but traditionally and in the latter half of Pilate's prefecture, he does have to report to the governor of Syria. But really, being the prefect of Judea was a more administrative role than anything else. It doesn't come with all of the powers and all the circumstance that being the governor of Syria would, or being the governor of Egypt, two areas of the empire that are of far greater importance. He would have less flexibility. He would be under a little bit tighter control than if he had been the governor, or if he was the governor of one of those provinces or areas of the empire that were more important. All of this is important in understanding the environment that he exists in and the environment that Pilate is dealing with. There's a temptation sometimes to think of Pilate as being a dictator or wielding absolute authority, free to kill and punish as he pleases, free to punish and kill at will. It isn't even slightly accurate. Now, don't misunderstand that the prefect is incredibly powerful in the region in which he has control. He has the control of the Roman military who is stationed with him. Now, not very many soldiers are stationed in Judea, but a handful of Roman soldiers are still the greatest fighting force in the world, and there's still a good deal of authority that comes with that. But sometimes the sort of attachment that we have to the idea of him being a dictator, him having absolute power, absolute authority, blinds us to the reality of the role and the reality of the opportunity and the position that Pilate was really in. We'll see some examples of why this, of some evidence really of how this plays out. But I think that all of that understanding really helps us to understand why it is that there's hesitation and much more about the man who is there whenever Jesus is brought before him. Now, it's long been held by a majority of historians, thinking about this question of how it is that someone of relatively low nobility got this appointment as the prefect of Judea. It's long been held by a majority of historians that it wasn't Tiberius, actually, the emperor, who awarded Pilate with the appointment. Rather, it was Sejanus, the Praetorian prefect. Now, hang with me here, because this is not just a sort of forgettable individual in history. This is Sejanus, as played by Patrick Stewart on a BBC show when Patrick Stewart had hair. He since has only appeared bald, a very wise decision. But there's a bust of Sejanus. Now, Sejanus is not an irrelevant detail of history in the narrative of Pilate and in the potential understanding of how this moment has an impact on Jesus. The Praetorian prefect was one of the most powerful positions in Rome, one of the top aides to the emperor. And at the time of Pilate's appointment in 26 AD, Tiberius, the emperor, was actually in a sort of quasi-retirement, leaving the Praetorian prefect in charge of day-to-day affairs in Rome. So Sejanus was at the time the most powerful person in Rome in 26 AD, whenever Pilate was given his commission as the prefect of Judea. Why would he have chosen Pilate? There are two theories widely circulated amongst historians as to why Sejanus may have elevated Pilate to this position. One is a more honorable one, that he knew Pilate's family, that he was close to Pilate's family, or that he had some pre-existing relationship with Pilate from military service. The other is that Sejanus, who was himself deeply anti-Semitic, a well-documented anti-Semite, wanted to appoint someone else who was deeply anti-Semitic, who would share his vision, his distaste, his dislike of the Jewish people, and who would sort of keep them under the thumb of Rome, and that Pilate fit that bill. Like I said, that's a much more nefarious option. I must tell you, there are some very serious historians who propose this and promote that second theory, but I'm personally not much of an admirer of it myself. I think that Pilate's cruelty is largely overstated by Josephus and others, but we can't rule it out. It's an interesting possible detail, and it's a detail that is examined and thought about seriously by a great number of historians. Now, this relationship with Sejanus is important for at least one more reason, because Sejanus was eventually executed for treason. And had Pilate been appointed by him, it would become incredibly important that Pilate demonstrate his loyalty to the Caesar, Tiberius, not to Sejanus. Now, depending on the date of Jesus' crucifixion, the details of that and where that would break down could have a major impact then. The relationship with Sejanus, his execution for treason, all those things could have a major impact on where Pilate's head was on the day that Jesus is brought before him. The earlier potential date in 30 AD may have meant that Pilate wanted to keep his thumb on the Jews to continue impressing the acting leader of Rome. In 30 AD, Sejanus was executed in 31. 30 AD, Sejanus would have still been in control. Pilate maybe could have been tempted to keep his thumb on the Jews to impress Sejanus. The later date, 33 AD, may mean that Pilate is still looking to demonstrate his loyalty to Tiberius. Now, consider that in the context of what we know is used against him and used to kind of push him towards executing Jesus. Now, this is regardless of whether it's the early date or the late date. This is probably a very tense 3-year period that Jesus is executed in for Pilate, between Sejanus being executed and the appointment of a new Roman governor in Syria in 32 AD. There is a lot going on in the period for Pilate. There's this made-up bust of Pilate. It's not an actual bust. It's a sort of computer-engineered bust of Pilate. There are at least 4 events from Pilate's tenure as prefect that we have historic record of, and I think all of them provide us a sort of interesting patchwork of who he was, an interesting image, a little snippet each one gives us of who he was. Josephus recounts an event that happened very close to the beginning of Pilate's tenure, perhaps even in the first weeks of Pilate's tenure, in which the prefect, new to his role and eager to make his stamp on the region, moved to display images of Caesar in Jerusalem. In the dead of night, he had soldiers of Rome move into Jerusalem these images affixed on flags of Caesar, as a way to remind the people who the city belonged to. Now, and the fact that he did it at night shows that he knew it was going to be controversial. The fact that he did it so early in his tenure, we can pretty much conclude that he was doing this as a way to make his position known, to gain the respect of the authority that comes along with being prefect. Well, images like this, especially of a foreign leader who claimed to be God, you could guess did not go over well with the Jews at all. In response to this act, a large crowd of Jews walked the 75 miles from Jerusalem up to Caesarea Maritima and surrounded Pilate's house, demanding that the images be taken down. Assuming that their energy would quickly die out, Pilate largely ignored them. After 5 days of them surrounding his house, he summoned the crowd to an arena. There in the arena, Roman soldiers drew out their swords as a way to threaten the Jews. In response to the drawn swords, the crowd of Jews pulled down their cloaks and showed their necks. They stuck their neck out towards the soldiers, exclaiming to the prefect that they would rather have their throats slit than to have the false images of the emperor in their city. How magnificent is that? I mean, that is some serious dedication. The prefect relented. He ordered that the images of the emperor be taken down. We see examples of this throughout history. We talked about it at previous times, where the religious zeal of the Jewish people creates this interesting relationship of sort of respect and admiration in some ways, curiosity in other ways, between the Jews and the Roman leaders. But that's one of the best examples in all of history that we have. Not long after this incident, Pilate, likely knowing that he needed to build goodwill, chose to undertake a building project. Strategy worked for Herod, who was a very difficult leader himself, but was in some ways forgiven because of his building projects, or at least tolerated because of his building projects, so maybe it would work for him. Pilate wanted to build a new aqueduct for Jerusalem, but to build it took money from the temple treasury. Can you guess where this went wrong? During one of the feasts, a mob came to where Pilate was staying, furious that he had taken money from the temple treasury, and in response, Pilate sent out a handful of Roman soldiers into the crowd, dressed in plain clothes with clubs in their cloaks. And upon his orders, his instruction was that they were to sort of rough up members of the crowd, to sort of beat members of the crowd, again, as a way to show that he was the one in control, show that he had the authority. Well, it didn't go quite as hoped. The Roman soldiers took it a little bit too far. They ended up killing a handful of Jews, and Pilate's relationship with the Jews because of this incident was deeply, deeply impacted. It was the exact opposite effect of what he needed in this moment, this hope of this building project, this aqueduct that would help bridge this gap between the Jews and him. It led to the exact opposite outcome. There's at least one more incident that took place before Jesus was brought before Pilate, depending on the date when he was brought before Pilate, that I'll mention. Remember, the importance of showing loyalty to Tiberius, something that we should always keep in mind when we think about the episode between Pilate and Jesus. After Sejanus' death by execution, Pilate came up with a great way of showing his loyalty. He would display golden shields in Jerusalem bearing an inscription honoring the emperor. They didn't include an image of the emperor, just an inscription. He had learned his lesson from that. But just an inscription honoring the emperor. They said, Tiberius, son of the divine Augustus. Including the word divine is probably where this went awry. Yet again, the Jews form an uprising because of this. This time, things got so bad. This is in late 31 AD, approximately, probably sometime in late 31. Sejanus is executed in October of 31 AD, so probably late in 31. This time, things get so bad that Herod Antipater went over Pilate's head and wrote directly to the emperor Tiberius, warning him that his prefect was risking a riot, that his prefect was risking losing control of the region. Tiberius angrily reprimanded Pilate, made him take down the made him take down the shields, and the threat was ended. Now that story I find particularly interesting, especially if Jesus was crucified in 33 AD, because this incident, perhaps with the Herodians going over Pilate's head and petitioning directly to the emperor, could be, one might deduce, the reason that Herod Antipater and Pilate are at enmity with one another, as we're told in the book of Luke, prior to the day that Jesus is killed. Could this be the explanation of where that enmity came from? Maybe. I just want to note also the fourth sort of thing that we know for sure historically about Pilate is the reason that he was eventually deposed by the Syrian governor, and that's because of an incident at the very end of his tenure. It's the end of his tenure because of this incident in around 36 AD, where a group of Samaritans led by a false Messiah are going to dig up these artifacts that they believe were buried by Moses. Pilate dispatches a group of troops. They slaughter these Samaritans, and the Samaritans or other Samaritans who weren't part of that group petition to the Syrian governor. Remember, the Pilate, the prefect, answers to the Syrian governor. They petitioned to the Syrian governor to have him removed, and he was. So, all of these stories should paint a more complete picture of the prefect, of the role that he played, of the power that he had, and the interaction that he had. Here are some of the things that I think that we can conclude from those handful of historic examples about his interactions. One, he is not an all-powerful, bloodthirsty tyrant. There are checks on his authority. He very well might be an anti-Semite. He very well probably detests the Jews. He certainly doesn't understand them. He certainly doesn't have a tremendous amount of respect for them. He certainly tries to poke and prod at various points throughout his tenure. But there are multiple levels of checks on his authority. He's not allowed to just do as he wills to these people. This is not a conquered territory, an occupied territory in the way that we see occasionally with other governments that carry a heavy hand. Two, this is really important. He is willing to budge when faced with a hostile crowd or when there's pushback on him. The first example, I think, is the best example of the entire ordeal. When the Jews show their neck there in the theater at Caesarea Maritima, and he backs down. He takes down the images, the flags of the emperor that he had put in place in Jerusalem. He is willing to budge when faced with a hostile crowd. He is responsive to the needs and whims of a hostile crowd. And I think this is especially so after he is reprimanded in 31 AD by the emperor himself, by Tiberius himself, over the incident with the shields. He doesn't want to invoke a riot. He doesn't want to invoke the anger of Caesar. 3, he needs help with his relationship with the Jews. That's an extremely important one. Clearly, this is a man who may be deeply loyal to Rome and may have a strong understanding of Rome, but he does not have a strong understanding of the Jews. And for this reason, he needs relationships with the members of the Jewish authority. He has to depend on the Jewish aristocracy to help bridge that gap that clearly is there between him and the people. Caiaphas and Pilate had a great working relationship. We know that because of how long both were in their positions. Pilate wasn't there when Caiaphas was appointed. He was appointed under Valerius Gratus, or that Caiaphas got the role of high priest under Valerius Gratus, but the two of them were deposed together. That relationship is very important, the one between the high priest and the prefect, in maintaining the two things that Rome cared the most about. We've talked about this repeatedly in this class and in this time together. The two things that Rome cares the most about is keeping the peace and collecting the taxes. And that relationship between the high priest and the prefect is essential in maintaining that balance. Every single one of the factors that I laid out, that I think that we can conclude from those historic examples that were given about Pilate, every single one of those factors would play a role on the morning that the Jews bring a Galilean peasant who they claim is stirring up the people to the front door of the prefect. I made reference to this before, but it's not unique that Pilate would put a Jewish peasant to death, not even a little bit. It's probably not even unique that he would do it merely because the Jewish leaders wanted it done. The only thing that is unique on this morning, Friday morning, leading up to the Passover, the day of preparation, is that he doesn't want to do it. So let's look at the text. Let's look at John chapter 18 here and look at the text. Then they led Jesus from Caiaphas to the praetorium. And it was early morning, but they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Pilate then went out to them and said, "What accusation do you bring against this man?" They answered and said to him, "If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you." And Pilate said to them, "You take him and judge him according to your law." Therefore the Jews said to him, "It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death," that the saying of Jesus might be fulfilled which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Jesus, and said to him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered him, "Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me?" Pilate answered, "Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here." Pilate therefore said to him, "Are you a king then?" Jesus answered, "You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice." Pilate said to him, "What is truth?" And when he had said this, he went out to the Jews and said to them, "I find no fault in him at all." Okay, so in the early morning, Jesus is led to the praetorium. Where is the praetorium? Well, we don't actually know. Not for certain, anyway. There are a couple of likely locations that could have been the praetorium, but the praetorium is wherever the prefect is. It's sort of like Air Force One. Air Force One isn't a specific plane. It's whatever plane the President of the United States is on. That's the case with the praetorium. So they lead him to wherever the prefect is. This is likely a place that Pilate would stay every time he came to Jerusalem, every time that he was there for a feast or some other occasion. But precisely where it was, Fortress of Antonia, Herod's palace, likely potential options, but we do not know for sure. So Pilate comes out to meet them, and John notes something really interesting, that they wouldn't go in lest they be defiled, so that they might eat the Passover meal. Well, why would that make them defiled? Why would going in make them defiled? We have no idea. This has been the source of a lot of disagreement, but John says it so matter-of-factly that it seems like that it would have been obvious to the first century reader, whatever the reason behind this was, whatever the justification behind this was. John's going to use this narrative construct through the course of his retelling of these events that is really masterful. The outside and use of outside and inside over and over. He does this brilliantly. Really a masterful construct that he gives us. But I don't think in any way that it's fair to say that he adds this detail just for the purpose of providing this narrative. Occasionally we'll see some suggestion like that he's concerned more about the in and out, the light and those things, in the light, out of the light. I don't think that that's a fair accusation. There's some reason why they refuse to go in. It could be because they fear leaven would be inside. There could be any number of reasons. We just don't know. All four Gospels record the exact same question being asked of Jesus in the initial interaction with Pilate. It is written in the exact same way in the Greek in all four. Not a single word, not a single thing changed between the Greek. And this is quite rare. From the garden to the cross, there are several differences in the dialogue that each writers give us. But here, this question, the question that Pilate first poses to Jesus, is the same word for word in all four Gospels. Are you the king of the Jews? Now, it's important that to understand this process and what's going on all around this and to sort of slow it down, that we make a couple of notes here. Whenever we discussed the trial before the Sanhedrin last week, I spent a good deal of time explaining this process of a Jewish trial, how it would flow, what the rights of the accused would be, etc. There was a format that a Roman trial would typically follow, but Jesus' trial, and at least in the details that we're given about Jesus' trial, do not follow it at all. It is so far removed from what would be an expected format of a Roman trial that it isn't even worthwhile for us to really discuss how a Roman trial would have typically gone. Now, this is the case for Jesus anyway, that it doesn't follow this pattern. It's not relevant for Paul later, who we do see more of the format, but for Jesus, there's really no semblance of the traditional format of a Roman trial. So, was his trial unfair or illegal? I think we can say with certainty, more certainty even than last week whenever we talked about whether or not the Sanhedrin trial was illegal, that the trial before Pilate was not illegal. First of all, Jesus is not a Roman citizen. And there's nothing that indicates to us that a non-Roman would be afforded the same process as a Roman would. That's why Paul's process is slightly different. There are a few things in the text that you can recognize as being different between the two. Second, though, we can deduce, especially from Josephus, who gives us several other examples of people appearing before prefects, that the prefect has the full right of an independent investigation and an independent verdict. So, especially when dealing with a non-Roman, he is not bound by these rules and procedures that would be in place. There seems to be a reasonable amount of historic precedent that would suggest that certainly for a non-Roman citizen, this is the case, that the prefect has the right of independent investigation and of independent verdict. This is important. This is really important because you need to understand there is no form of process that can save Jesus at this point. There is no right of the accused that can come into play. There is no witness tampering or need to align the testimony of multiple false witnesses. There's no, the police handled the evidence incorrectly that can invalidate the proceeding or invalidate something that's brought against him. There is one man standing between Jesus and the cross. One. But with all that being said, Pilate first chooses to punt. Luke gives us a valuable detail, but he's the only one that does. Luke chapter 23, starting in verse 4. Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no guilt in this man." But they were urgent, saying, "He stirs up the people, teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether this man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him over to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had long desired to see him because he had heard about him, and he was hoping to see some sign done by him. So he questioned him at some length, but he made no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him, and Herod and his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then, arraying him in splendid clothing, he sent him back to Pilate. And Herod and Pilate became friends with each other in that very day, for before that they had been at enmity with each other. Okay, so Pilate hears the accusation that's before him. This is one of the best pieces of art that we've gotten the chance to look at in the entire class. This is Caesarea, one of the best, I think, pieces of art about in the entire so-called Passion narrative. So Pilate hears this accusation. He raises the question to Jesus, and for some reason, this question of whether or not he was the king of the Jews, he doesn't find it to be enough to sentence him to death. But he really doesn't want to deal with this. He really doesn't want to deal with this morning, and whenever he hears that this is a Galilean, he sends Jesus off to Herod. This is Herod Antipas, the son of Herod the Great, probably the patriarch of the Herodians, certainly the living patriarch of the Herodians, who had been part of the group that had been conspiring against Jesus just days before. We're not told that Herod Antipater himself was part of this conspiracy, but certainly the Herodians as a group were part of this conspiracy. But rest assured, he knows who Jesus is. He's heard of him. He's heard of the wonders and signs that he does throughout Galilee. Does Jesus know who he is? Does Jesus know Antipater? Absolutely. No question. First of all, Herod Antipater's palace is less than 20 miles from Nazareth, where Jesus grew up in Sepphoris. Second of all, this is the man who killed John the Baptist, someone who is an incredibly important figure to Jesus, an incredibly important personal figure to Jesus. We sometimes treat John the Baptist as a wild side figure and ignore the extremely intimate role that he played in Jesus' life. But this is important in this moment. John mattered a great deal to Jesus. John mattered a great deal to the people of Jerusalem. Remember earlier, the Jewish people overall, we know that he had a strong following, a strong reputation still at this point. Remember just a few days earlier in the temple when Jesus is asked this question about where he is from, and he responds to them by asking them this question: Did John's baptism come from man or from heaven? John was still held in very high regard by the people, and obviously by Jesus himself. Remember, too, as Luke tells us, Jesus' life begins under threat from a Herodian, Antipater's father, Herod the Great. His family is afraid to return to the land, even after Herod the Great's death, out of fear of Antipater's brother, Archelaus, who has long since been dead. He died in 4 AD, but has long since been dead at this point. So, Herod Antipater is in no way an unknown figure to Jesus. This is a weighty meeting. How tempting may it have been for Jesus to air his grievances to Antipater at this moment. The Herodians had wreaked havoc in Galilee in so many ways. Many people were made poor and displaced by their self-aggrandizing building projects all throughout the region and all throughout Judea. Herod's family had caused problems for Jesus' own family. How tempting may it have been to show him this power and the signs that Antipater so badly wanted to see. It was not a short exchange once Jesus got before him. Luke says, quote, he questioned him at length. But Jesus' response, as we see multiple times throughout the course of these trial proceedings, nothing. Jesus gave him nothing. Why did Pilate send him to Herod? I think one reason is obvious. He is delaying and hoping that their desire to kill him subsides. Is This because he particularly cares about whether Jesus lives or dies? Maybe. But I think more likely it's a stalling tactic, hoping that the crowd will die down. Maybe they will move on to something else. Pilate's already made it clear to them that he doesn't want to kill him, that he rejects the charge that was brought before him, rejects the other charges that they've tried to levy in this sort of, mass pile-on that they attempt to do of charges and reasons that he should be killed. He doesn't find any sufficient reason among them to crucify him, as they had hoped. So it makes the most sense, or sort of the most obvious, that perhaps this was a stalling tactic. But it was a tactic that did not work. It had not weakened the desire of the leaders, nor had it reduced the size of the crowd. In fact, if anything, it appears that the crowd has grown by the time that Jesus returns to Pilate after having been in front of Herod. At this point, whenever Jesus is returned back to Herod, Pilate could have easily just appeased them and killed them. But there's something about this man that prevents it. There's something still that he clings to, something still that gives him reservation. What is it? I wish we knew. I wish we could say why it is that Pilate was so hesitant on this morning to render a death sentence. We don't know. Was it because of his wife saying that she had been tortured by this man? Even before his wife told him this, he had his reservations. Was there something in this Galilean rabbi that he saw that made him empathetic to the Jews in a way that he was not usually empathetic to? What was it? I wish that we knew. He has two tricks left up his sleeves. And upon Jesus' return from Herod, he tells them, Herod found no fault in him, and I haven't either. The same sort of conclusion, if you will, that he's already reached before. He tells him, I'll scourge him and release him. Now, scourging a prisoner is no small effort. We will discuss it in all of its gory details next week, but this is not probation. This is not a slap on the wrist. This is serious punishment. It's clearly done in the hopes that that will be enough. Often Roman scourgings before a crucifixion were not as violent, though, as we occasionally see. And this often was meant to serve as a form of embarrassment. Remember, the entire ordeal of crucifixion is about embarrassment. It's about showing the superiority of Rome, showing the inferiority of the criminal. Scourging could play the same role. It was about embarrassing the prisoner as much as it was about a punishment. Now, again, though, this sort of role of it being an act of embarrassment was especially true and particularly true about those who were going to be crucified. The Romans were careful during a scourging of one who was going to be crucified to ensure that the scourging did not kill the prisoner. One who was not being crucified, though, as Pilate was trying to avoid at this point for Jesus, would be beaten far more brutally than one who was going to be crucified. This is an important detail for us to understand the pain and torment that Jesus has to experience here in the final hours of his life. Had it been determined at this juncture, before he is scourged, that he is going to be crucified, the scourging would have actually been less painful on him. But because Pilate is going to use this scourging as a hopeful opportunity to appease the Jews and the crowd, Jesus is going to get a much worse beating than if the circumstances had been reversed. He had to be made an example of. Now, do not confuse Pilate's reluctance with the likelihood of a gentle scourging at all. Just because Pilate had, for whatever reason that we cannot understand, had these reservations, do not think that this meant that the scourging of Jesus was light. Jesus was beaten to within an inch of his life, and every bit of evidence that we know about afterwards, how quickly he dies, the fact that he can't carry his own cross, points to this fact. But this would not be enough to appeal to them. A scourging would not be enough to appeal to them. The crowd had grown bloodthirsty now, not merely for a scourging, but for a death. John shows us that the chief priests and the elders had been using this time with moving back and forth between Pilate and Herod, had been using this time to stir the crowd into a frenzy. Pilate offered them to release a prisoner, a custom that he says they have during the feast. Where did the custom come from? We have no idea. When did it begin? We have no idea. Was this the first time that it had ever been done? Was he sort of pulling a rabbit out of a hat here to see if this could be something that spared this man's life? Maybe. Was this the only time that this was done? Maybe. We have zero precedent or historic information about this custom. Zero. We don't know. It's possible that Pilate created it on the fly. We have no idea. But the person that they demand to be released is not the innocent Jesus, not the one that Herod has found innocent, the man who killed John the Baptist. He found him innocent. Not the one that Pilate, a man who sent multiple Jews to crucifixion, have found innocent. The one that they demand release is Barabbas. Barabbas is not a mere thief. He's not a mere robber. Far from it. He's an insurrectionist, a murderer, an actual enemy of the state. Why on earth would the Roman prefect allow an actual enemy of the state, a true insurrectionist, to walk free? The only possible explanation is that the crowd had grown completely out of control. It's no longer just a few members of the Sanhedrin and Caiaphas asking him, demanding of him, pleading with him that he kill this people, driving this ship. They've created a monster. Mark says that Pilate wanted to satisfy the crowd. Matthew says that Pilate fears a riot. The crowd has gotten out of hand. This entire ordeal has gone out of hand. It has escaped the control of the prefect. The one thing that a prefect is never supposed to allow to happen. It is slipping away. Any potential that this man would go free is evaporated by this moment. By this point, when the crowd demands Barabbas be let free, the crowd has stood up demanding that Jesus be the one crucified. Any potential that Jesus was going to avoid the cross, regardless of what Pilate desired, regardless of what anybody desired, was evaporated. The deed was done. It's after the scourging, according to John, that the soldiers partake in maybe the most sadistic act of all, perhaps caught up in the excitement of this bloodthirsty crowd themselves, satiated by the inhumanity of it all. They twist a crown of thorns and put it on his head and place a purple robe across his back. Pilate, in one final act, has the judgment seat brought out among the people. His questioning of Jesus up to this point had taken place inside the praetorium, but they moved the operation then outside. Perhaps this is one last effort to hope that it demonstrates the innocence. Maybe if they can see this man and see him questioned before them, that he'll see his innocence. But I doubt it. I think the most likely fact at this point is that Pilate has reserved himself to the fact that Jesus is going to be executed. He has accepted that Jesus is going to be executed. And by taking this operation outdoors, he reserves his own position. He allows him to be the one that delivers for them the hope of their bloodthirst. It's the 6th hour. These proceedings have been going on for a long, long time. Jesus has been in custody now for probably about 12 hours. Maybe longer, maybe a little bit less, but approximately. This has been a long process. This is not just a rapid thing, one thing after the other. This has been a long process. Pilate's judgment seat is placed among them, and Jesus is brought out, bloodied and beaten. It's really hard for us to imagine this scene. I think that sometimes we don't even try. We don't even really try to envision what it looks like. But this is not someone with a few bumps and bruises who merely has a crown of thorns and a robe across their back. This is a man on the verge of death, unquestionably in traumatic shock, barely able to stand. He likely has a collapsed lung. He's likely struggling with each breath. Blood is probably dripping to the ground underneath him. He's dehydrated. He's dirty. He's exhausted. So when Pilate says to them in this moment, as John records for us, "Behold your king," one should probably conclude that he is just merely joined in with their masochism. It's no longer a question of justice. That ship has sailed. This is an act of self-preservation by the prefect. This is the prefect trying to regain control, I would argue. "Shall I crucify your king?" he asked them. They certainly agree. He delivers him up to be crucified, and immediately Jesus is led away. It's hard to think about the moment without being emotional about it. It's done. The decision is rendered. One man who had the power of the sword has determined that Jesus will die. We've gone through 2 separate weeks of trial here, and I think that it's important that we reflect a little before we go into next week's class dealing with the brutal nature and the torture that's about to be inflicted upon Jesus. The decision's made. History has been stamped. Jesus Christ will be crucified. Jesus of Nazareth will be crucified. But what exactly, after 12 hours of trial, is the charge? For what reason will Jesus be crucified? The Sanhedrin brought scores of false witnesses before him, but they couldn't find a charge that would stick. They couldn't get their stories to align. It was eventually the high priest himself in that dramatic moment placing the accused under oath, exokazine, and asking him to tell them whether or not he was the Messiah. That is what brought about the conviction of blasphemy. So was it blasphemy that led to Jesus being crucified? Was it even blasphemy that Jesus had answered the question the way that he did? We have zero precedent to say that it was. A serious trial before the Sanhedrin ended with an emotional verdict, but a verdict nonetheless. The Sanhedrin had checked their box. They had done their part. But blasphemy meant nothing to the Romans. And by the time they walked Jesus in the early morning from the house of Caiaphas to the praetorium, their reason for requesting his death had changed. Pilate asked why they had brought him, and their first response is a rather flippant one. Well, if he wasn't an evildoer, then we wouldn't be here. That doesn't move him. They accuse him of misleading the people, as if Pilate would care about that. They accuse him of telling the people not to pay their taxes to Caesar. That one's one that could be dangerous, but clearly that charge doesn't stick either. They say that he called himself the King of the Jews. This is a charge referenced in all 4 gospel accounts. And this is the one that eventually draws Pilate's questions. But he doesn't find him guilty because of this. He says that, in fact, he doesn't find him guilty even after the line of questioning about the King of the Jews. Pilate never finds him guilty on any charge. There's not one specific charge that we're given that Pilate finds him guilty on. Herod does not find him guilty of any charge. So why then is this man put to death? The only reason lies with the crowd. All of the evidence is clear. Despite all of the careful, tactical effort of the high priest and the leaders who wanted to kill him, ultimately, no charge led to Pilate's judgment. It was the crowd that led to Pilate's judgment. There's nothing illegal about Pilate bending to the will of this crowd. The prefect has the power to make a decision based on whatever reason he wishes. But there's no honor in it either. But it's hard to blame the prefect. It's hard to say that Pilate is the ultimate reason that Jesus is killed. It's hard to say that the Sanhedrin is the ultimate reason that Jesus is killed. They don't have the power of the sword. No single individual deserves the full weight of blame. It's the crowd. Do you see the magnificent layers of symbolism in this fact? Even in its historic context, the actions of many, not mere chance, not the decision of one, not false witnesses, not the decisions of 71, the actions of many are what caused the death of Jesus. No matter how much we examine the historic narrative, no matter how much we examine historic facts, no matter how much we try to piece this thing together for our understanding, it does not change the central fact of who is at fault on this morning. We are. we are. See you next week.